Caitlin Bissonette. I'm the extension plant pathologist with the University of Missouri, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about scouting for soybean diseases. And this is going to be important because when you walk into a soybean field at any place in the Midwestern US, there are all different kinds of diseases that you might find, and understanding the growth stage and where it is on the plant is going to be important. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. When you first walk into a field, and you're scouting, you really need to know what the objectives are for when you go to scout for the disease. The first thing is, what key diseases are you looking to identify? Mainly, understanding that not everything is biotic or caused by a living organism is a really important thing to remember. Some things are caused by maybe damage from a tractor, maybe it's just from deer walking through a field and feeding on plants. Not everything is a cause of a disease. Other things may need a laboratory diagnosis or a second opinion, if you will, in order to get a proper diagnosis of what disease you're looking at. So being able to identify those diseases sometimes is a little bit harder than just walking into the field. Another objective of scouting is to record the field history. Knowing what diseases are occurring in the field can help you to understand what diseases you might face in the future as well. And so taking notes in one season can help you in future seasons. Scouting can also help to provide insight for management options in the current season, such as spraying a fungicide, maybe not needing to spray a fungicide, as well as understanding what types of management decisions you might need to apply in future years, such as sampling for soybean cyst nematode, or perhaps applying different types of amendments to the soil in order to improve different areas of the field. Now, when we think about soybeans and disease, we also have to take into consideration what type of growth stage the plant is at. And so there are different publications available through various extension, university extension publications that have soybean growth stages listed out, these different infographics. Here's an example of one through the University of Illinois Extension, and they show the different life stages and growth stages of soybean. And using and utilizing these infographics can really help to understand what the different growth stages are. And during this presentation, I'm going to utilize this particular scale in order to talk about the different diseases that you might see at these different growth stages of soybeans. Now, I want to just give a heads up and let you know kind of how I'm going to format this particular presentation. So for every disease, I will have a disease name listed at the top. I will also have an image with a soybean plant, which will have an arrow pointing to where on the plant you might find this particular disease. There will also be a picture of the disease, an example of what this might look like on a plant. And then at the bottom, there will be a bar highlighted with when in the season you might want to scout the field to look for this particular disease. This is kind of the time frame when this disease shows up during the season. So this is kind of a guideline of what we're looking at for all these diseases I'll be talking about. Now, just to start with, there are many diseases that can impact soybeans in the Midwest. There are many foliar diseases that can show up. Some are more common, some are less common. More common diseases include the Frogeye leaf spot and Septoria brown spot diseases. Less common include soybean rust and target spot. Those are a little more located in the southern part of the Midwest. Stem diseases can show up at multiple times in the season. Some are more located in certain areas of the Midwest. And then there are seed rots, seedling and soil-borne diseases, nematodes, seed and pod diseases, as well as viral diseases. And I will touch on each of these categories at some point in the presentation. But like I said, I'm going to go from the beginning of the season through the end of the season and how to scout at different times during the season. And so this is just to give an overview of different diseases you might see during the field season. Now, I'm going to start off with early season diseases. These are often referred to as seedling diseases, which include Pythium root rot, Phytophthora root rot, Rhizoctonia root rot, and Fusarium root rot. You can also find nematodes that infect seedlings early in the season, such as the soybean cyst nematode and the lesion nematode. Many of these look very similar. So these infect the root system, and they look very similar in the field, where you can see wilting or dead plants between the VE growth stage and sometimes up into the V2 to V3 growth stage. So what this looks like for Pythium, the Pythium species has death of the plant very early in the season. Usually you can see this appearance of the in the emergent stages. Sometimes seedlings never come out of the ground, or in the VE growth stage to the cotyledon stage, maybe even into V1, the plant will wilt and die. Phytophthora sometimes gets into the V2 to VT growth state, V3 growth stage, and often has a purpling color to the lower stem. And so but the plant will remain fairly green on the top part, and the leaves will remain intact. So that is a little bit different in Phytophthora. So Phytophthora also can continue on into the mid-season, and so that's a little bit different than some of the other early season diseases. Rhizoctonia, much like Pythium, also can infect very early in the season, and so you'll see those dead plants very early on. And then Fusarium, like Phytophthora, can continue to infect more into the mid-season, into the V2 to V3 stages. So these are all early season diseases that can impact soybeans, and they are all root rotting diseases, and so they survive in the soil, and they live in that soil. They live in the soil. Now, Septoria brown spot is another disease that can start fairly early in the season. Oftentimes, it can be detected as early as the V2 growth stage. This is caused by Septoria glycines, and you can see there are brown spots that start to appear on the lower leaves. That is followed by yellowing, and then this yellowing appearance here, which is actually caused by a toxin that is exuded by the pathogen. And then what happens is over time, this toxin will be produced and cause the yellowing to expand and result in leaf drop. So what happens is this pathogen survives on soybean residues present at the soil surface. And in some areas, Septoria brown spot can be found very widely, and in other areas it is a little bit more sporadic. Quite often, it is restricted to the lower canopy. So you can see here, your scouting needs to start in that lower canopy, and it can start in that V2 to V3 growth stage and continue all the way through the growing season. And so this is a disease that you can see really at any point in the growing season, and it favors high humidity in that lower canopy area. Bacterial blight caused by Pseudomonas syringae subspecies glycines is characterized by dark spots, kind of those brown spots, often with a yellow halo. not to be confused with Septoria brown spot. These lesions will coalesce or grow together, and it is a disease of the upper canopy. And so this disease will start in the top of the plant, which is different than Septoria brown spot, which is a disease of the lower canopy. This is how you can differentiate the two. And it is common during wet weather, especially in irrigated fields. This disease is also common in the mid-season from about V2 to V3 all the way through R4, R5. So it is something to kind of keep in mind that bacterial blight can be confused with Septoria brown spot. So understanding where in the canopy you find it, it is important because bacterial blight is caused by a bacteria, whereas Septoria brown spot is caused by a fungus. And so there are differences in management tactics for both. Now, downy mildew is another disease that is present around the same time as Septoria brown spot and bacterial blight caused by Peronospora menscherica. And this disease is very weather dependent. It likes cool, wet weather, and younger leaves are more susceptible to infection. And so you'll often find it in the upper canopy, much like you do with bacterial blight. Also, it is present during that V2 to V3 growth stage, all the way through R4 to R5, depending upon the season. And so you'll find it, and you'll see this yellowing, these almost yellow flecks on the top of the leaves. And when you flip the leaf over, you'll see this gray downy growth on the underside. And that is characteristic of downy mildew. Oftentimes when I'm out scouting in a field, I will see downy mildew. And when you see that yellowing on the top of the leaf and you flip that leaf over, and you really want to find out if it's downy mildew, what you'll see is that gray fluffy growth on the underside. Now, white mold is another disease caused by Sclerotinia sclerotiorum. It is also referred to as Sclerotinia stem rot. This is another cool wet weather disease. It is very common in the mid to northern areas of the upper Midwest. And what's really important about this disease is the need to look for apothecia on the soil surface. And these are present on sclerotia. And so you can see this little black structure on the stem. And that structure is a sclerotia, which is a hardened survival structure of the fungus. And what happens is at the end of the field season, that structure will fall off and it'll stay at the soil surface, or it'll stay attached to a residue, and it'll stay at the soil surface or be in the soil in some way. And apothecia, which are the fungal structures that are produced that allow for the spread of this pathogen, are produced on top of these sclerotia, and they spread this pathogen to flowering, to the dying flowers of soybeans. And so checking for these apothecia during that early flowering period is very important to reducing infection. And so this disease is a lot more common in fields that have narrow rows or very dense canopies because it reduces the ability for airflow to reduce moisture. And so high moisture, cool conditions really favor this disease. What happens is you'll start to see wilted, dying plants in patches in a field. Sometimes you'll see a single plant that looks like it's just dead, and then there will be several around it. And you'll see when you pull back those plants, you'll see this white, fluffy growth, and then these black structures. And if you split open the stem, oftentimes you'll see black structures inside the stem. And these black structures, or sclerotia, can remain in the soil for multiple years and lead to infections several years down the line. So it's really important to find ways to control this pathogen and scout for it before it becomes a problem, because the more disease happens, the more problems for future years. And so area of the canopy that you're going to be looking is inside the canopy. Now, soybean cyst nematode is another pathogen caused by a microscopic roundworm called Heterodera glycinis. Sometimes you'll find yellow stunted plants in a field that occur in patches, but often in many parts of the Midwest, we don't see any visible above ground symptoms. What you want to do is gently dig up plants and look for these yellow to white females on the roots. And so you can see these yellow dots on the roots. Those are the females of the soybean cyst nematode. And these here are the nodules. And so you can kind of see the size comparison. They're about 1/10 the size of a nodule. And so those females will produce around 250 eggs. And there are around 3 to 6 generations of soybean cyst nematode in the soil every year. If you haven't sampled for soybean cyst nematode in a field and don't know if you have it, a good time to look to see if soybean cyst nematode is present in the field and scout is around the flowering period, because there's a likelihood that soybean cyst nematode will be present on the roots of plants. So gently digging up those plants and looking for those white females between R1 and R3, that is a good time to do that. But it's important, gently dig them up and shake off the dirt. If you want to look to see if you have yield loss associated with soybean cyst nematode, taking an egg count either prior to planting or at planting or just after harvest of soybeans are the two best times to do that. And so that's why those times are selected there. Frogeye leaf spot is an emerging disease in some parts of the Midwest and well established in others. This is caused by Cercospora sogina. It causes round tan lesions with a reddish to purple border and really is favored by warm, humid weather. Oftentimes, newer leaves are more susceptible, so you'll see it in kind of that mid to upper canopy level. And that is the area which you'll start to scout for that. It really starts to show up in the reproductive stages. Oftentimes, the farther north we go, the later in the reproductive period we start to see it. So Missouri, we start to see it maybe in the R2 reproductive stages. As we move farther north, we might see it R3, R4, maybe even into R5. And so what you're looking for are these circular lesions with a tan center that have that reddish to purple border. And they almost look like frog eyes. Over time, all of those lesions can coalesce and they can get large. But that is in very severe cases. Oftentimes we see a little more sporadic lesions like this. Soybean vein necrosis virus, or SVNV as it is often called, is a fairly new disease. It emerged out of Illinois in 2009. And this disease has shown up throughout the Midwest and really can occur anywhere in the canopy and often occurs along major veins. And the reason for its name, it causes necrosis or death of the veins. And it is characterized by this almost blotching on the leaves. And this disease is transmitted by thrips. And what we do know is thrips favors drier years. And so there is a likelihood that we may see higher levels of soybean vein necrosis during dry years. So the timing that we really look to scout for soybean vein necrosis virus is during the mid reproductive stages through the late reproductive stages. So about R2 through R6 is a good time to go out and scout for that. But what's really important to remember with this disease, as compared to some others, is it can occur anywhere in the canopy. There's no particular area that it needs to be in the canopy. As we kind of move through the season, we're getting into the later stages. And so charcoal rot is caused by Macrophamina phaseolina. And this disease is a little bit different than some of the others that we have talked about so far. This disease is much more common in dry years or in dry regions. And this starts as a premature yellowing, followed by wilting and plant death. And what happens is there is a buildup of black microsclerotia. And so you can see these black dots on, this is a soybean stem that has been split in half. And you can see there are little black dots here. And these are microsclerotia, which, if you'll remember from a white mold, are survival structures. Sclerotia are survival structures. These are tiny survival structures of the fungus that have built up inside the soybean stem, and they can be visible near the season end on or in the stem. So this is the inside of the stem, and this is the outside. So you can see they've built up inside and outside of the stem. And once it is present in a field, they stay in the soil and they survive there for several years. But when you're out scouting, you want to look for those premature yellowing and wilting of plants, especially in maybe drier areas of the field, especially under irrigation. This might be more of an issue. And you can also see in the lower stem some of these microsclerotia starting to build up as the season progresses. The wilting may start in the early reproductive growth stages, but you will start to see the microsclerotia build up and be present as the reproductive growth stages progress, so more into the R6, R7 phases. If it is an especially dry year, premature senescence will start to happen on these plants. Now, brown stem rot, on the converse, is a disease that likes wetter weather. This is caused by Phyllophora gregata. It is an infection of the roots and causes a yellowing and browning of the between the leaf veins. In some cases, there may be no yellowing or browning of the leaf veins, depending upon the type of pathogen it is. There is an A and B type, but oftentimes we do see this yellowing and browning between the leaf veins. This can be easily confused with sudden death syndrome. So it's important to slice open the stem and look at the inner pith tissue, so that center tissue of the stem, and see if there is browning of that inner tissue. And if there is browning, that is brown stem rot. And so that is important to cut open the stem and look at that inner tissue. So when out scouting, not only do you want to look at those leaves, those upper leaves, but also cut open the stem to differentiate it from other diseases. Which then brings me to sudden death syndrome. This is caused by Fusarium virguliforme. This is another infection of the roots, which the seedlings were susceptible early in the growing season, and it also causes this same yellowing and browning of the root of the leaf tissue. What happens is over time, those leaves will yellow, brown, and eventually fall off. The petioles of the plant will remain intact and the leaves will have fallen off. And the vascular tissue itself will be discolored. And so on the right is an example of a plant that has been affected by the sudden death syndrome pathogen Fusarium virgiliforme, and you can see it's a little more brown, almost gray in appearance, whereas the plant on the left is healthy and white. And so there is definitely a rotten appearance to the plant on the right as compared to the plant on the left. Sometimes, as you continue through the season, if infection is very severe, fungal structures that are blue in color will appear on the taproot, and this is in some rare cases, especially under high disease pressure. So again, not only do you want to look at the foliar symptoms, you also want to cut through that stem and make sure you don't have the browning of the inner tissue, that of the inner pith tissue is not entirely brown, that resembles brown stem rot, but is just discolored. Another disease that has started to emerge as an issue in some areas of the Midwest has been Cercospora leaf blight. And this is caused by Cercospora cucucii, which results in the bronzing and purpling of some of the upper leaves in the upper canopy. This is a result of, this follows warm, humid weather, and generally you want to start looking at the leaves that are exposed to sunlight. And the reason for this is this bronzing is the result of the toxin that is produced by Cercospora that is called cercosporin that is reacting with sunlight. So it's almost like the leaves themselves are getting a sunburn. Another thing that can help to identify this disease is oftentimes when you touch the leaves of this particular that have been affected by this particular pathogen, these bronzed leaves also have an almost leathery appearance. And so this is an example of what that might look like in the field. If disease gets very severe, it can also result in leaf drop. And so this is an example of what that might look like, where the leaves have fallen off the plants. So those top leaves that were closest to the sunlight have fallen off as a result of severe Cercospora leaf blight. And this yellowing has occurred because the cercosporin toxin has overwhelmed the leaf tissue, and so you are left with these petioles intact. And you can see, if you look closely, there are little brown lesions on the top of these petioles, and that is also the Cercospora pathogen that is left present there. Now, purple seed stain is related to Cercospora leaf blight. It is also caused by Cercospora cucucii and results in a purple discoloration of the seed. And so you'll see that I do not have a soybean plant listed here or shown here, but rather the soybean pod. And so this purple discoloration of the seed is after this warm, humid weather has come in, resulted in Cercospora leaf blight infection, and often leads to infection of the pod, which leads to this purple discoloration of the seed. Now, it's important to remember that this does not necessarily result in yield loss, but rather results in quality losses due to the discoloration of the seed. And so that is something else to keep in mind. But you can start to check for that as in later in the season, because you'll start to see Cercospora leaf blight in that R4, R5 period, all the way through into the R6 period. But then once pods begin to mature in R7 and R8, that's when you can start to check for purple seed stain. Now, pod and stem blight caused by Diaporthe phaseolorum, var. Soje, is characterized by black dots or pycnidia that are lined up in rows on the stem or on the pods. Sometimes you'll see them on the pods, and they are almost in concentric rings. And this is really favored by wet weather, especially nearing harvest. This will increase disease. This also can increase the risk of seed decays as you get closer to harvest. And so what you're looking for is you want to start to scout into the stem portion of the plant around the R6 through R8 period. And so it's really closer to the harvest time. That's when you're going to start seeing pod and stem blight show up in a field. Related is Phomopsis seed decay, and these are caused by Phomopsis species, various species, also pod and seed infect the pod and seed. These are associated with other stem decays in the Diaporthe complex as well. They colonize the seed, as you can see here. This is a white fluffy growth that has occurred. And this is especially apparent during delayed harvests. And so you can start to see these during the R7 into R8 period, or if you have a really wet fall, even if harvest is not delayed, if you have wet conditions leading up until harvest period and it hasn't been delayed, sometimes you will see some of these seed decays start to show up. And so these are things to scout for during that time period. You can get a good idea of what you might be dealing with leading into harvest. Now, I just wanted to summarize kind of the time periods that I talked about for all these different diseases leading up to kind of what different time periods you might want to scout for different diseases during the season. And so this is a synopsis of what I just talked about today, ranging from the early season root rots, starting in the early vegetative growth stages at VE, all the way through the Phomopsis seed decays into the V8 period, along with the pod and stem blight and purple seed stain. And so this is just a overview for your information, just as kind of the way that I think about scouting for disease when I walk out into a field. If you want more information about diseases or what to scout for, how to scout, there's information available through not only the Mizzou IPM website listed here, but also through other local extension websites. Information on sampling for soybean cyst nematode and soybean cyst nematode in general is available through the SCN Coalition at thescncoalition.com. And then especially information and disease fact sheets, of severity estimation tools, and kind of all things disease management are available through the Crop Protection Network. With that, if you have any questions, you can feel free to get in contact with me. I am also director of SCN Diagnostics, so feel free to shoot me a tweet at KMBIS or at SCN Diagnostics. And thanks for listening and happy scouting.